Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's WISCAPE virtual discussion on fostering student learning in remote environments. I'm Carrie Dickinson, the Programs and Communications Manager at WISCAPE. I just wanted to start with a few technical notes. If you experience any difficulties during the discussion today, technical difficulties, please feel free to send me a message using the chat tool on your screen. I will do my best to help. If you are wondering where the chat tool is, look for the chat button at the bottom of your screen. It's the one that looks like a word bubble. Or alternatively, you can click on the participants button, the one that looks kind of like a person, and select my name. Depending on the device you are using, you may not see both of these options. In addition, you are welcome to submit a question for the presenters at any time during the discussion. We will leave time for Q&A at the end. To submit a question, please do not use the chat tool. Use the Q&A tool, and that way the presenters will see your question. To find the Q&A tool, look to the lower right of your screen, or click on the button with 3 dots at the bottom of the screen. And now I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. Emily Baker is the Assistant Director of Learning Design, Development, and Innovation in the Division of Continuing Studies. She manages a team of instructional designers, technologists, and media specialists that focuses on developing online programs across campus. Jonathan Klein leads online learning design and development services for the College of Letters and Science. In that role, he coordinates support for online learning initiatives and serves as an advisor to the LNS-CIO and the Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning Administration. He works simultaneously as an instructional technology consultant, providing direct support to instructors who are transitioning classroom-based teaching to an online experience. Maria Widmer is an instructional designer with the School of Education. Maria is also a PhD student in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, where she studies issues of access and equity in online higher education. And finally, our moderators, Anna Lewis and Brenda Spychalla. They are the co-CIOs for the School of Education and co-directors for the School of Education's Media, Education Resources, and Information Technology Group, or MERIT. And with that, I will now turn things over to Brenda.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. Only a few weeks ago, but it seems like maybe longer than that, on March 17th, faculty, instructional staff, and instructional IT staff were asked to shift to alternative delivery of courses to be in effect March 23rd through the end of the spring semester. In response, they transitioned over 7,000 courses within 10 days from residential education to remote instruction. Today's panelists were all deeply involved in transitioning courses in their divisions: the School of Education, the College of Letters and Science, and the Division of Continuing Studies. All of the panelists will share key lessons learned that can inform best practices for successful teaching, learning, and student engagement in remote environments. In preparing for this panel, panelists identified 3 major areas for reflection. These include organizing the institutional support response, supporting faculty and instructor efforts, and finally, supporting effective practices for online teaching and learning. Before we hear from our panelists, please see a link to a Google Doc in the chat. This is where all are welcome to enter observations and build a shared understanding of this work. As Carrie mentioned, we will have a formal Q&A period after an engaging discussion by our panelists. So for the first lesson area, which is organizing the institutional support response, we have an opening question for Emily Baker, which is, what did we learn about organizing support in an effort to transition courses to remote instruction?
Thank you, Brenda. So when it was determined that the entire campus was going to go remote after spring break, a very decentralized campus with multiple support systems had to come together to coordinate an effort. And this was to help ensure that instructors were supported who were going to have to pivot to online, ensure access for all students who are going remote, and to also level set quality expectations to ensure a positive student experience and make sure, students are feeling supported as well. So I'm going to kind of break down those 3 different areas that our group focused on. So first would be supporting instructors. So instructional designers, instructional technologists, campus leaders, and online all came together to create a group called the Continuity of Instruction Group. They did this because, like I said, there were so many different efforts going on across campus, and it was important at that moment that we all come together in order to be more efficient and effective to help over 7,000 courses go online in 10 days. With this, we created 2 different types of main roles. We had batch leads and we had readiness resources. We did this because each school and college and department has its own, often unique needs. And this was going to help us make sure that all those needs were being met. Batch leads worked with leadership in the school, department, college that they were assigned to, and then they also worked with Central Campus to make sure that all the needs in that department were being met. They also worked or were assigned readiness resources that were then working directly with instructors in that school, college department to help them get their content online, and then also bring back any concerns or issues to the Central Campus group and to maybe bump it up to campus leadership when needed. Another way that we looked into supporting these instructors that were being required to pivot online was to offer professional development. So again, at UW, very decentralized, there's a lot of groups across campus that are doing professional development for different audiences, so maybe TAs, some for instructors, some for blended, some for fully online, and a lot of different formats. Some are very casual, here's a topic, come in if you'd like or are interested, and then some are more like long, like semester-long programs like Teach Online, if anyone's ever heard of that, is a semester-long program where you learn to teach online. So all of those groups came together and kind of created a holistic plan on how to meet the needs of instructors and TAs. So some examples of this were offering kind of like open office hours, but with a topic attached. So if you are interested in discussions, you could go to an open office hour on discussions. If it was, you had questions about maybe synchronous sessions, they had an open office hours on that. They also upped the number of like active teaching labs and other things that were happening on campus already to be offered multiple times a week. During the week, the 10 days we had to go live. We created some new webinars that were more all-encompassing of how to put your course online in 10 days, stuff like that. The second area of effort would be access. All students have a lot of different needs and different challenges with going remote. And so we needed to focus on how we were going to ensure that every student who was on campus in spring could complete their semester. So some of examples of what we did was allowing some students to stay in the dorms when appropriate. So some students couldn't go home or didn't have access to the internet at home. International students, some couldn't travel right away and go home, so we had to accommodate them. One of the biggest things that we found was bandwidth issues when students did go home. They're used to campus with really good bandwidth, and maybe at home, if they're in rural areas or just depending on where they live, they might not have access to the bandwidth that we're used to. So a lot of design considerations went into that. So for example, allowing more flexibility in windows to take an exam or quiz because internet fluctuates and some students would be kicked out or something and would have to come back in. So we needed to give them a little bit of extra time to get through some of the assignments. Smaller chunks of content. So instead of having an hour and 15-minute video, which might be difficult for a student to stream, we recommended that everyone chunk it down to 15 minutes or less. And then in addition, when necessary, offering like transcripts, making sure your slides are uploaded so a student may read a transcript instead of streaming a video, depending on their capabilities at home. Flexibility in synchronous sessions, we always suggest that people record them so that a student may have to go back and watch it later because their internet might not be working or they might not have good bandwidth in the moment. So they can still participate, but after the fact. Access to technology, there's a lot of students who depend on the computers on campus to do coursework. And now they were going home and libraries and other places weren't open, so they didn't have access to those technologies. So some examples of what we did here is laptops for extended checkout for students. So we already had some of these systems in place, but some of them just needed to change their policies, or we needed to get more laptops in there to get it out to more students at once. Also, some of the libraries created kits that students could check out with webcams and microphones to take home. And then didn't quite happen in time for spring, but for summer and fall, there's a fund that has been created to reduce some of the tech costs for students who can't afford it. So it could even be money towards paying for Wi-Fi at home, or reduce costs for required course tech purchases that they would, use a computer on campus for that technology, and now that they're at home, they may be required to purchase it. The third level or area of effort that we focused on was level setting quality expectations. For spring, it was a little more basic. We were just really focusing on instructors being able to complete the courses with students. So, we expected them to be in communication with students, getting students content, having a way for students to give them their assignments, whether it was in Canvas or email or Box. We were really flexible in spring, just knowing we had to pivot so quickly, and not everyone was familiar with all the different technologies on campus for online. And then for summer, we kind of created some new criteria of expectations that were a little bit higher level quality, and that will continue on into fall. And those type of criteria would be, the courses designed to include regular interaction between the instructor and student to student. Lectures and course materials are appropriately adapted for remote teaching. So we're kind of more suggesting that people use Canvas. We're not just allowing people to email content anymore. It also can't be a self-guided course. It has to have regular interactions with the instructor. Credit hour equivalent. The online course has to be equivalent to a face-to-face course in credit hour. So the same amount of content that you would have in a face-to-face needs to be online. And then remote methods for assessment and grading and feedback are clearly planned out and outlined for students. So those are just some of the expectations that we're kind of ramping up with for summer and fall for online. So this is kind of the 10,000-foot view of what campus did to ensure student engagement in spring and summer and moving forward into fall for remote instruction. Any questions that we have about the process that transpired or any specific details that you would like me or the panel to dig into deeper?
Thanks, Emily. It looks like we don't have any questions yet in the Q&A, but I really appreciate that comprehensive overview of all of the moving parts that needed to be glued together to get us through spring and into summer and now planning for fall. We'll, I'm sure, come back and there will be questions that will touch on this. For our second area, lesson 2, focusing on faculty and instructor efforts, we have Jonathan Klein. And Jonathan, you regularly work with faculty and instructional staff to design fully online courses. For the purposes of thinking about the instructor and student experience, What are the main differences between traditional online learning and the kind of remote instruction we experienced in the spring?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually think that the terminology that is sort of embedded in your question is kind of an important one to address. And I think the truth of it is that in the midst of what has been a pretty fast-paced environment, I don't know that I've fully taken time to appreciate the true nuance of the differences between traditional online and remote instruction like we've experienced in the spring. But there's a few things that do come to mind, and the terminology is important. I think back several years when MOOCs sort of became what was known to define online learning as a modality. And there were certain ways in which that was useful because I think it did elevate the role that online instruction can play. But there were some features of what MOOCs were, massive open online courses that were sort of self-paced in many ways, self-directed, instructor to student ratio that was sort of off the charts in terms of what we might do here at this institution. And so I do think in terms of attempting to define online learning versus remote instruction is a significant thing, and I hope that this is something we can sort of continue to unpack as this disruption unfolds. But there's a few things. I think number one, if anyone who's joining us in this session was an instructor in the spring, it's not news that to you that this wasn't really a conscious choice you were making. It was just sort of a hand you were dealt. And so I do think that in traditional online learning, this is more of a conscious decision that people are making, and they're prepared and oftentimes eager to develop an online course. For remote learning, it's really just taking an instructional plan that probably existed prior to what was spring break in our case, and just making a shift to make that work, that same plan work online. So there's, I guess, an element of choice at play. Second, I've sort of alluded to preparation. A typical online course development process unfolds over many months. And there's an opportunity to really fully consider the opportunities within that modality and to really carefully select technologies and try out technologies that work to accomplish your learning goals. In a remote environment, it felt in the spring like we were, like people were maybe trying to navigate the array of technologies that were available, but then also at the same time sort of responding to intermittent disruptions that would occur due to significant load on platforms. So it feels potentially a little less stable in that regard. And then I would also, I think design is a relevant topic as well. So with a traditional online course, it's become kind of customary here on campus that experience is fully built and ready to go on day one of that course starting. So the entire semester is planned, materials are prepared, they're often situated in a learning management system and ready. And really what the instructor does is they assume a role of facilitator where their chief responsibility is to facilitate and engage with students. And often I find that that's one of the more appealing in retrospect, like opportunities with online learning, is that much of the instructional content development is front-loaded. But in remote instruction, it's managing design, development, and facilitation all at the same time. And so I think there's a lot of ways that people rose to the occasion and did magnificent work, but it does take a toll on an individual to sustain that over time. And so it feels like folks who did that are probably breathing a sigh of relief that the semester is over, and probably trying to recoup from what was a pretty eventful end of the semester.
Thank you, Jonathan. are there any takeaways in terms of how can faculty and instructional staff work more effectively with you to design remote classes or to transition a class from in-person to online instruction? What can they do to make your job easier?
That's a good question. I'd like the take of other panelists as well. Maybe the one thing that I would say is there's a lot of titles for folks who are in a support capacity. You know, we have instructional technology consultants or specialists. We have people who have a role of instructional designer, a media developer. Like, these are different roles that exist in the support community. And maybe the thing that I would say in terms of, it's not necessarily making my job easier, but I would say those folks have training and experiences that go well beyond the technical. So those are people that that an instructor can engage with in pretty significant dialogue related to the teaching challenges they're having. A lot of times there's a tendency to want to ask and answer a technical question, but I would say giving, if you're working with somebody in a support capacity, giving them a fuller context of the challenge would probably allow them to help in ways that they may not if it's simply characterized as technical. So that's maybe one thing. I'd be curious if others have ideas about that as well.
Emily or Maria, did you have other thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda and Jonathan. I might only add that folks who are working in a support capacity approach this work from a very non-judgmental standpoint. We view ourselves as partners in thinking, in supporting you and in supporting students. So in my experience, there's a fair amount of vulnerability that can come in expressing a lack of knowledge or an unfamiliarity with the teaching process or a tool. And so where possible, being open about that area for growth in working with this partner can go a long way towards moving towards the next step. So don't be afraid.
Emily, did you have any additional comments on that?
I think they kind of both covered what I was thinking. I guess just there's a lot of opportunities for professional development in this area on campus. And I can always tell when an instructor has taken advantage of those, coming in prepared just to know some of the basics before they get to work with a designer is sometimes helpful, but not necessarily a requirement. Just thinking of, a way that would, sometimes that transition's a little smoother when they've gone out and kind of learned some of the basics of what is, online.
I'm looking at the Q&A and wanted to share a question with all three of you in this area. If you think that it's realistic to expect students to absorb the same depth of information in an online format as they would in an in-person format for a given number of credit hours. Is there sort of a balancing of content and expectations around that?
Well, I guess this is maybe where I revisit the remote versus online as just a way of filtering, organizing my thoughts on this. I don't think there's any reason why an online version of a course cannot meet the same learning outcomes. And I think we do that with traditional online learning that has gone through a rigorous process of exploring options and designing that experience. And I also think that in the remote context, the same can be true. And I think it may feel less stable at moments because of, factors that really exist beyond the context of the classroom and the course content. Like, individuals are at their home in whatever circumstances that they never imagined, which is, that's one of those differences between remote and online, is that online, when you enroll, you know what your circumstances are typically, you know what that's going to be. when there is a disruption, any number of individual circumstances can impact this question about whether someone can manage the factors at play in their own life to engage substantively in a course. So there's so many variables in that question. I don't know. I would throw it back to my other panelists to see if they have thoughts on this.
Or we can also come back to it at the end of the session. I think I agree. There's really too many factors to there's too many variables involved to narrow in perfectly. Let's go to lesson 3, and we'll keep that one in mind and come back to it. Lesson 3 is around effective practices for online teaching and learning. And Maria, what is something that we have always known about fostering student learning that the pandemic has underscored?
Thanks for the question, Brenda. I am selfishly pleased to take this one, as this is what it's all about, right? All of the institutional planning, instructor preparation that Emily and Jonathan have shared so far get towards this guiding principle and priority of student learning and success. So as I look at the 117 attendees on the list here, I see an amazing community of people who I know have decades of teaching experience online. And so my answer to this question likely will not prove to be a surprise to any of you. And I'll front load maybe my answer in a way that speaks both to student learning and teaching, knowing that these two are so intimately connected. So I would say off the bat, clarity, presence, and engagement. And from there, I want to give a little bit of a preamble that speaks to some of the expertise that's here in our virtual room, even though we can't see each other. So starting with an acknowledgement that my perspective is shaped by the disciplines that are housed within the School of Education, Arts, Education, and Health. There's a scholar, Stephanie Giardini, who talks about the challenge of parachuting instructional approaches across different cultural or instructional contexts. And so just a recognition that my response is shaped by that perspective. I'd also like to bring to this answer a response that's grounded in learning sciences and educational research, but one that also speaks to my own teaching practices and the experiences of the instructors who I've been lucky to support, some of who are in the room here. My colleague Janelle Anderson reminds us often that teachers' stories matter. And so while we have folks who work in the support role here in the panel today, I wanted to bring in some of the lessons and stories that I've encountered from those teachers. So for me, Brenda, your question was around what we have always known about student learning, but this moment of pandemic has only served to highlight. And indeed, Emily spoke to this earlier, that students experience their learning on our UW-Madison campus, in Madison, in Wisconsin, in the United States, very, very differently. It speaks to the different access to resources, technology, or otherwise that Emily mentioned, different access to social capital that makes the idea of reaching out for help more or less possible. And so these differences contribute in some to the fact that students experience their college education and their learning differently. Cliff Conrad, who I think is on the line, is the faculty director for WISCAPE, and he often has reminded me that one of the best supports for work is to take a walk. And so the other week, walking on campus, I had occasion to reflect on the spaces, human resources, and services that we have designed and financed to promote student learning and success in a way that helps to hopefully mitigate some of these inequities in accessing resources. So that can be something like a beautiful flower planter that says, this is a space that's welcome, we want you to be here, and we're going to work towards making this somewhere that you can navigate through easily. So what does this mean for student learning? It means that the high expectations that we hold for our students have to, and indeed usually are, coupled with high degrees of support. And so this is where I think we get to these 3 points of clarity, presence, and engagement. And from Lynn Glick, who leads the Discussion Project Faculty Development Program, I've learned the importance of being really, really clear about what we're asking students to do and why. We've been socialized, many of us, in a physical classroom space. We know where to go to sit. We can expect that a teacher might be at the front of the room. And so the interface of the classroom, we've been socialized to have that enough so that that environment can kind of recede to the point that we're thus able to focus on the learning itself. And that's not always the case in the online environment, right? I've heard Jonathan speak over the years about this idea that we put time and money into designing beautiful environments that are easy for students to navigate, that help them get towards that learning. And so this research that shows that design and organization positively and significantly influence students' perspective of their own learning and satisfaction, I think speaks to the fact that to the extent that we can, being really, really clear allows for those barriers of navigation and access to recede, to focus on the learning itself. I would speak also to the idea of presence. Jonathan mentioned this dichotomy or transition of the instructor role from sage on the stage to guide on the side. But there is so much evidence to show that even as the guide on the side, the teacher's presence in that online classroom matters so much for student learning. It's that regular substantive interaction that Emily spoke to, both social and cognitive, that goes a long way towards creating this message that I want you here, I care about your learning. And so with that foundation of support, I can set these high expectations that I'm going to help you to achieve. And then the last point is that knowing that we experience our educations differently based on who we are, where we come from, what we have access to the extent possible, we can strive to provide multiple ways for students to engage with and reach those learning outcomes. I know some of the teachers on the line here are familiar with this idea of universal design for learning, which is an approach to facilitation and curriculum design that speaks to providing additional pathways to student learning and success. So where possible, maybe one more means that a student can represent their learning, one more way that they can express what they've learned, one more way that they can engage with those materials. So Emily talked about transcripts or captions as a way of helping students who may not have the bandwidth then to be able to access the lecture video. That's a perfect example. On the whole, clarity, presence, and engagement sound maybe like broad and these are goals that we always work towards. Anna Lewis, who's on the line here, has reminded us in this moment that we're all learners. And my spouse last night over dinner reminded me, teaching practice is a practice. Practice makes perfect, right? So there's this book, Small Teaching Online, that I would highly recommend, and it speaks to ways that we can make even just little changes that have just an outsized impact on student learning and success. I would close with one of my own personal experiences in my own teaching practice, which was in an online course of 225 students. At the end of an exam early on in the semester, I thought, okay, students didn't do as well on this as I would have liked. What's an easy way to show that I care about them reaching that next step? I sent out a quick, almost template email to students who had room for improvement, and received a response from one student who reflected, this is the first time in my college career that a professor has ever reached out to me. So even a really small effort on my part really went a long way towards providing that foundation of support that allowed me to set high expectations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria and Jonathan and Emily. This is Anna, and I just wanted to take a moment to try to reflect some of what I heard from the panelists before we get into a lot of the great questions that have been submitted to us as well, is that just like instructors are trying to meet learners where we are, the support infrastructure is trying to meet instructors where they are. And I think sometimes the infrastructure that we took for granted that supported us in the face-to-face world wasn't necessarily meant or meant to function as effectively in the online world. And so I appreciate, just like the instructors are, quickly working to move to this remote environment, how quickly the support system has also moved. And I think acknowledging that, it's all to the purpose of improving the learning experience for our students. With that, I want to ask some of the questions that have bubbled up. And so one of those questions would be, I'd like to hear more about what communication and guidance is being done to reduce the stigma about online learning. Any of our panelists want to volunteer to take that?
I don't have an answer on this one. I'll just leap in here a little bit and hand it back to the panelists. But I think we've been so busy with delivering the transition that we maybe haven't had enough time to reflect on how to be communicating the opportunities, the advantages, the environment, and how it really is supporting learning. I think the challenge is to be able to focus on that while we are sort of running alongside the trains with delivering these new online courses.
Perhaps another question then to throw out is, it sounds like someone would be interested in hearing more about what support and guidelines exist for UW-Madison instructors for accessibility.
I can say a little bit to that. So there is a space on campus, the McBurney Center, who works with students who have accessibility needs. And you can imagine when we pivoted to online, some of those have changed. A student who may not have an accessibility need face-to-face may have one when they transition to online. And so McBurney Center works with all those students and then directly contacts instructors. The stance is if a student has an accommodation need, we accommodate. For remote instruction, so 7,000 courses going online in, overnight, we did not build for accessibility, but in a regular online course, we always build for accessibility, which means things like transcripts are always created. We, tag images, tag links, make sure that the pieces of the course would meet accessibility needs, more or less. If a student had an accessibility request, that the course is set up to work for them. Maybe a couple more pieces might need to be added to just ensure that that student has a seamless experience. But in remote instruction for spring, summer and fall, really, right now, McBurney is working just directly with instructors and designers and have support staff to make sure that those courses are accessible to students who have accessibility requests.
Thank you, Emily. And knowing that we've got a lot of questions here, I want to be able to ask some more. Any guidance or best practices for trying to deliver remotely what is usually hands-on instruction, like simulations?
I guess I can jump in here at the fear of letting another question pass us by with no substantive answer. The one thing I can say here is that this is hard. This is really hard, and it's especially hard to do it on the fly when a decision is made and you have a week to prepare for it. So I think preparation can solve a lot of problems where you have the opportunity to consider it. This isn't an issue where there's easy answers. Campus is attempting as part of a phase 2 response to dig into some of these questions in anticipation of the possibilities for fall, which we don't quite know yet. So I don't know that there's clear campus guidance on some of these questions, and I guess what I can say is there's an ongoing effort with folks who teach these courses, that might have a lab component, to investigate and to share back some lessons or strategies. I'm not involved with that work, so I don't know exactly, but all I can say is that it's hard work, and it's people are engaged with that pretty heavily right now to see what kinds of opportunities there might be in anticipation of whatever lies ahead in the fall. I don't know if anybody on our panel has something more concrete other than to say we're working on it.
Jonathan, I might. Oh, Anna, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I might just jump in with two observations. One is that while often at UW-Madison we like to think that we're exceptional, there are folks across the country and world who are working to creatively respond to some of these challenges. So I know that disciplines approach these questions differently, but that there are amazing existing networks of faculty members and instructors who are collectively using their experience and creativity to resolve some of these. The other point I might make is just that there's an opportunity perhaps to be really clear about what the specific learning objective is for a given lab or hands-on experience. I know I have a K-12 colleague who is a woodworking teacher who has invited his students to practice the kinesthetic outcome using cardboard or other materials that are available at home. A dance instructor who may be using a contact improv approach, which relies on attention to pressure points and balance, might ask students to explore those types of outcomes using different supports that are available to them within the room. So there's certainly a fair amount of creativity required, but perhaps separating this skill or the exact outcome from the materials or environments that are required to get there can be a useful way to start to think about that.
Okay, I'm going to give a heads up to Emily that somebody asked a question if she was able to share more about the fund available to students to reduce tech costs associated with online instruction. And we're hoping to share out some links with the group where folks can follow up afterwards. For now, I'm going to share a question about assessment. And this person said, I think one of the most important aspects that's unresolved is the issue of assessment. Specifically, is campus going to provide instructor students with methods of testing that are secure, and specifically methods to limit cheating? I know this is a big topic, so and with lots of opinions and thoughts.
One thing I would like to challenge people, just to piggyback off of what Maria just said about the objective, and if you really need a high stakes test to show or demonstrate understanding of a topic, or if there's different ways to do your assessment, that's something that we kind of pushed a lot of instructors to think about in spring when we still didn't quite have proctoring or secure testing option for campus. I know we have Turnitin if instructors are worried about plagiarism. It's not quite probably the answer that this person's looking for. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about the proctoring or options for that.
I would maybe in a sympathetic way to the factors that play in spring. That was a case where a syllabus was written and the plan had to, every assumption you had about how that was going to play out changed. And so whereas a high stakes assessment made a lot of sense in that context, it was especially difficult to figure out what the options were within that fast-paced change of events. And so I think that's where, if shifting gears to fall and the prospect of doing some planning or thinking around alternatives if we're in some kind of a remote situation, like I think that's where what Emily and Maria are describing about thinking about that learning objective and maybe taking a different, opening up other possibilities. I get, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that that was probably a difficult and very tall order to negotiate in the midst of an existing semester. It was already mostly over in some ways, right? There had been more time face to face than there was left to be in a remote situation. But that's also where I think where there are disciplines where the high stakes exam is a necessary part of doing an assessment. It's where I think we're hopeful that we'll have a better set of technologies that accommodate the context where in the spring that was an especially difficult and challenging moment of trying to figure out how, from a technological standpoint, to add that capacity.
So maybe as long as we're thinking about challenging technologies, we had a question about video conferencing platforms, and that is the centrally supported platforms versus some other platforms like Zoom that aren't necessarily centrally supported. And so we know that many students have had to learn up to 3, although I know it's more than that, video conference platforms, which has caused problems of their own. And is there anything that we can do to reduce this area of tension for students or instructors for the fall? I feel like I'm the queen of asking the questions that get the long pause. I will also acknowledge that for many, many years here on campus, we had multiple learning management systems, which also caused tremendous struggles and required students and faculty to learn multiple platforms. And we only recently all came together around Canvas. And so, for right now, a lot of instructors are voting with their feet. And, there is a proliferation of tools. I think campus has tried to evaluate tools for security and support purposes, because we know that we don't have right now the bandwidth to support non-supported technology. So maybe if anyone else on the panel has additional thoughts on the multitude of video conferencing tools.
I always recommend to use campus-supported tools, always, because as an instructor, you're going to end up having to deal with tech questions that you probably don't always know the answers to, because the help desk won't be able to answer them for students. So Zoom, just off the bat, I know a lot of instructors like it. I use it in my personal life with family and friends to connect right now, and I understand it's very easy to use. But there are also a lot of underlying issues that you may not understand when using some of these other tools, like FERPA violations for using Zoom. And so I would recommend Blackboard Ultra ultimately for web conferencing. It's supported by Campus, it's built into Canvas. A lot of students have used it because it's probably the most widely used of all of the tools. We just signed another contract, I believe, for that. So we should have it for, I think, 2 more years at minimum. So it's not going away. But yeah, it's tough. But in the moment, students can also get help when they're having an issue with it. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. And then this might be looking at the time, knowing that we have about 5 minutes before we want to wrap up, a question for panelists to reflect upon. Folks have spent a lot of time thinking anew about how to organize a mix of lecture, group work, individual work while mastering these new technologies. Could panelists give examples of how you provide faculty with software and technical support that they can use to better organize their courses?
I'll share a few thoughts in response to this question. One is that that's a tall order, right? Mastery of these tools, I don't have. And instead, perhaps a way to think about it could be to model the type of resilience and creative problem solving that we want our students to adopt through our own instructional behaviors. So I would say don't hold yourself to the standard of having to master these tools. Where efforts are maybe best spent are in exactly what this person proposes, thinking about how best to organize a mix of lecture, group work, individual work, and then when getting really clear about what those instructional moves and learning experiences will ideally look like, then support staff with that clarity can help collaborate with you to think about the particular technical configurations that might be required to do so. So I think that's one answer. Another might be more broadly in thinking about this mix of lecture, group work, individual work to think back to the different types of interactions or presences that Emily spoke to earlier. So student-to-student interaction, student-to-instructor, and student-to-content, and making sure that there are opportunities for each of those to take place in a way that bolsters the overall learning experience.
If we have a second, I could add on to what Maria said. I think a little bit of this is in a planning process. I think that's maybe obvious. And what we're trying to do is, in anticipation of fall, put together different worksheets, guides, supportive materials to help walk individuals through choices that they can make. And a couple of those are, I've been looking and have found useful. We could probably share this in the materials that we have, but RICE offers a course workload estimator. And sometimes like just knowing the breakdown of what you're asking a student to do and then sizing that up with the credit hour requirement can be really helpful in just being super concrete about how students are spending their time, or what you're at least suggesting to them in terms of how they're spending their time with the experience that you put together. And then also, I think, whereas in spring, it was just like act now, there is a moment where we have the ability to plan, and sketching out thoughts, I think, prior to beginning to assemble or organize an experience can go a long way in feeling like you're doing that purposefully. And so that's where we're, well, at least I work for the College of Letters and Science, and we're on the verge of offering an array of planning tools that target different approaches one might take to answering the questions they have at play in their course. So those are some of the things that are maybe on the horizon and some resources that I often visit in thinking about this question.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I want to give just a final opportunity for Emily, Jonathan, and Maria to have a last sentence, or the thing that they would, if you have this time to speak with instructors or faculty or people who support, a last piece of advice you would have for us all moving in the summer session and thinking about fall. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to go first.
I can volunteer. One thing I've just heard from, being a part of the continuing instruction group, and then here today I heard bits and pieces coming through, is just this idea that we're all in this together, and we need to have some humility with ourselves, with our students, and with our colleagues and people that are trying to help us, and just understanding that, giving ourselves a break, giving our students a break, that this is not easy for anyone, and we're all going through personal and professional challenges right now. And just to remember that, we're all out here to help. The whole campus is in it to help you. One thing that I didn't get to add to the last one, but I do have some more resources. We have templates and other things that we want to share. And so when that final, when it's posted and the final email goes out, I'll make sure to include as many resources as we can to help people be successful in moving to remote.
Maria or Jonathan?
Go ahead, Maria.
I would add to Emily's reminder that we're in this together, that as a community, we have a lot of power in our voices. And so for the instructors or students who are on the call here, don't hesitate to advocate for yourselves, for your instructional needs, for your learning needs. By doing so, we can work to make sure that you are as supported as you need to be. So I think anyone on the line here would welcome an opportunity to use whatever positional power they have available to them to amplify those perspectives. And so while we're giving ourselves grace, we also need to fight for what we believe to be right on behalf of our students.
I guess I agree with Emily and Maria. Maybe the one thing I would double down again on the thing that I mentioned before, just like taking a look as there's a moment potentially before fall where things aren't frantic, to do a little bit of thinking and planning, because I do think that pays dividends later in making a much more seamless and intentional semester where those feelings of frustration are maybe minimized, and it does maybe save on that end to the points that Emily and Maria were making about being kind to yourself and taking just recognizing that this is a difficult circumstance, and there is a bit now that we can do to just prepare for that and get ahead for a moment. So
thank you, Jonathan, Maria, and Emily, and Brenda and Carrie. I've reposted the note to our shared Google Doc notes, in which we put a lot of links to follow-up resources that were suggested. And I want to hand it back to Carrie so that she can share future discussions.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the panelists and to everyone who joined us for today's discussion. I just wanted to let you know about WISCAPE's next virtual discussion, which will be a conversation with LeVar Charleston, the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the School of Education. And that will be on June 17th at noon, and you'll see some information on your screen. You can also find info on WISCAPE's website, which is wiscape.wisc.edu. Finally, we will be sharing the recording from this discussion along with some resources and links from the panelists probably within the next week or so. And so you can look for that info on WISCAPE's website as well, or also on our social media. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and again to the panelists, and have a great rest of your day.